Welcome to What We Made Possible, the podcast where we explore the power of healing and driving change for advocates, leaders, and change makers. The conversations here draw the connection between creating new possibilities in the world, possibilities of care, of belonging, of thriving for our communities, with stories of personal healing and loving relationship building. I'm your host, Patty Dayleg, leadership coach for social change. I spent a decade in nonprofits, government, and DEI, securing 6- and 7-figure opportunities for communities of color. And I've experienced firsthand the transformative power of compassion, healing, and belonging in making a bigger impact. Let's dive in. Welcome back to What We Made Possible. Today, I want to tell the story of my layoff from DEI. It happened in 2022, but we are in 2025 now, and with the current climate of dismantling DEI as policy, as crackdowns, as literally defunding research if it includes words like disparities and equity and community-based, this story is relevant. And I want to give some context. So diversity, equity, inclusion, it's kind of amorphous. It is, we could say like finance, we can say education, we could say sports. All of these are very much kind of umbrella terms. And so the context that I want to give is that very often with DEI, and especially right now with the dismantling of positions for diversity, equity, and inclusion, we associate that with hiring, with mentorship. But my background is really in change management, in policy, and supplier diversity. And supplier diversity is how we as institutions, as companies, as individuals, how we spend our money with diverse businesses. Businesses owned by folks of color. Supplier diversity also includes white women. It includes LGBT folks. It includes what they call service disabled folks, so veterans who became disabled. My focus when I was working within DEI is how we infuse these values into our everyday practices, into our everyday policies, in the criteria when we are putting something out. So essentially, for me, DEI was change management. How do we look at what we're doing? How do we do it differently so that we can infuse these values of being more diverse? How can we be more equitable? How can we be more inclusive? And I also want to name that DEI is not the same as liberation. Diversity, equity, inclusion really is harm reduction. It is meant to say, hey, the systems that we have built from the jump were built upon supremacist values. And that means that people with marginalized identities are going to have a harder time accessing services, accessing opportunities. And the whole point of DEI is to look at those disparities and to fix them. That is not the same as liberation, right? That is not the same as community. But with DEI being rolled back and dismantled, it has been ongoing since as early as 2021, 2022. And now we are in a moment where institutions are very loudly kind of bending the knee to this current administration and saying, okay, we're not doing it. And some of them are very quietly continuing to do the work under different names like belonging, or they'll kind of take this like we are including everyone approach. But again, that's really not what DEI is. And I really just wanted to give that context in terms of what does that mean for the work that I do, that we do, and what happened within the institution that laid me off, and what does that mean for them to eliminate a DEI position. Okay, so here's my story. I started off my career in nonprofits. And right out of grad school, I was working specifically with Asian American organizations. I have a public health background. And the big policy and the big issue of the moment in public health among immigrant communities and Asian American communities when I was coming up in my career was Obamacare implementation. And so I was really equity focused in the sense of we were trying to make sure that the Asian American community in New York City had the same access to health insurance options as everybody else. That the language that the state was using was accessible to them, that there was in-language resources, that there were navigators who could help you enroll into your health insurance. And that to me is not diversity work, it's not inclusion work, it's equity work because we are saying that there's a disparity in terms of access for communities based on language, but also based on their immigrant status. And we were saying we need to provide additional services and additional resources in order to make sure that this particular community has the same access. And so that equity work really started over a decade ago for me. Cut a few years later, I am now the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer within New York City's first Office of Diversity within the New York City Comptroller's Office. Now, the Comptroller is a finance position, right? The comptroller within New York City is a chief financial officer. They're doing audits, they're doing accounting, they're doing banking, they're investing the city's money, the city's pension dollars. They are looking at how much money are we spending? Can we root out fraud? Can we root out waste? And from the DEI perspective, because we had the view of where is every single dollar going when it's being spent from the city of New York, we asked the question, how much of those dollars were going towards businesses owned by folks of color and by white women? They called them MWBEs. And that was my job. We were looking at how much is the city doing. Another piece of context is that the comptroller is independently elected in New York City as opposed to other cities where the comptroller basically works for the mayor. And because of that, in New York City, it becomes a very much auditing position of this is how you can do better, mayor. This is how you can improve. There's a lot of policy recommendations that come out of the comptroller's office, always, regardless of who is in office. And so my position was a policy position and specifically around supplier diversity policy. At the same time, we were doing our own internal look at our own agency because we had a budget of, tens of millions of dollars. And we looked at how much of that was going towards women and folks of color. We were able to triple that spending in the time that I was there. We went from something like 13% of our dollars to 50% of our dollars were going towards MWBEs within 7 years. And I was there for 5 of those years. We also rewrote outdated policy. We looked at discriminatory policies. And I want to say that very, very often it's not going to say like, no MWBEs allowed, no Blacks need apply. That's not how policy is written right now. I mean, it's 2025, so maybe we're going to see some of that moving forward. But at the time, the policies were not written that way. They were really written in a way that sometimes was not mindful of how do we bring in the smaller companies? How do we bring in the more diverse companies? And one of my proudest moments was when we looked at the Banking Commission, which decided which banks in New York City can hold city dollars. Everything from the Department of Finance to your school on the corner has to put their money in a bank. And the Banking Commission decides like who is on the list of the banks that are allowed to take those deposits. Now, the New York City budget is $100 billion plus. It is one of the largest city budgets. And in fact, if New York City was a state, it'd be the 5th largest state last time I checked. So that's a lot of money that is going to the big banks of the world. And in our position, we were asking the question, can we put these deposits into banks that are run and owned by folks of color? There's a designation for this. It's called Minority Depository Institutions. It's a federal designation. I don't know if it's going to exist moving forward. However, at the time, we were able to gather many, many MDIs across the country and have them come in and speak to what are the requirements of becoming a depository institution of New York City. And one of the banks that came was Piermont Bank, which was the first bank to open post 2008, post recession, was founded by an Asian woman. And they were part of this conversation, and they told us there's part of these criteria that says that we cannot apply. We cannot be on this list because we don't meet that particular criteria. Now, the work of DEI is not to make your bar lower, but when we looked at this criteria, we asked the Banking Commission, is there a way that you can still prove that you have the capacity to take on city deposits without this particular criteria? Is there another way to show their capability? And we landed on what that was, which means that MDIs were now able to take on those city dollars. That was one of the most amazing things that happened in that work. And we did that across so many industries. I was talking to construction companies, I was talking to finance, I was talking to theater, I was talking to so many organizations. And by 2020, I literally created a training called How to Hire a Chief Diversity Officer. And I delivered it to hundreds of C-suite executives who at that moment were like, oh, DEI is important and we don't know what we're doing. And how can we bring someone in? It takes, again, this is change management work. My focus was change management work. And so how do you bring in that person to be effective and not just have them be like an island within your institution? Now, our philosophy, and this is still my philosophy to this day, is that the same way that you have a finance person, the same way you have an operations person, the same way you have a programs person, you have to have that focus on DEI. And it's not to say, for example, with finance, right? The process of getting payroll done. Very often what happens is the staff person has to log their hours if it's an hourly thing, or they have to prove that they've worked that time, right? Then the manager has to approve it. There's whoever your payroll company is like doing the thing, but your finance director is just making sure that everything is as it should be and they do the approvals, right? So if we're thinking about DEI as change management, the role of the Chief Diversity Officer is to look at, okay, are we doing this in an equitable way? Are we doing that in an equitable way? With the Banking Commission, for example, we were looking at, is your criteria discriminatory, not intentionally, but is there something that is holding people back? And we did it from a community-based perspective where we said, we're going to ask people, what's the criteria that is keeping you off of this list? And we did that across many sectors. Again, in 2020, people were asking us, how do you do this? And in 2021, we had been spending time teaching people how to do this over the internet, right? Like online, because it was during COVID. And there was also this changeover of the administration because there was a mayoral election. And so the controller was also terming out, and our positions were no longer in existence. This is relatively normal because when an elected comes in, they kind of create their own cabinet, and we happen to be part of the old controller's cabinet. And so, there's a kind of cultural reset every time a new administration comes in, and then they'll create new positions, they'll create offices, and those offices leave. So, we're seeing this now in New York City. Mayor Adams had a rat czar, and then there's this current Department of Governmental Efficiency that's happening, like DOGE at the federal level. This is like a fairly normal practice, is what I mean to say. But because we had been teaching folks how to do the work, there was 5 of us on that team, we kind of had the pick of what industry we wanted to bring our lessons to. So my team of 5, some of them went to other government agencies, some went to consulting, marketing, lobbying. I ended up on Broadway. But by 2022, within a year of me accepting my position, and even before that, maybe 11 months, 10 months, despite all of that success and all of that expertise, my position was eliminated. And of the 5 of us, 3 of us, so 2 other people, were also laid off. And I say that to say that these disinvestments have already been happening. Now, I want to give some context to my layoff because I don't have any anger or blame or anything like that for the company that laid me off. And I had some proud moments there too. I helped to create their first education program where they brought in kids and started doing talkbacks with the actors after performances. I was able to bring in a group of visually impaired folks and blind folks, and they were able to do a touch tour before they came to see the show. And we made sure that they had the correct equipment to be able to experience the show even without seeing it. I even got to give away 4,000 tickets to see the show. And in the midst of COVID, and as a person who worked across nonprofits and across coalitions in New York City, it was one of my greatest blessings to get to invite those service providers, those nonprofit folks who had been working so hard for immigrant communities, and they got to come see the show for free. That to me was one of the greatest gifts of that experience, along with getting to bring in a Black woman as a pyrotechnics intern for the show, because that is one of the most difficult positions and unions to get into. And I was part of the team that was able to create a position to work with the union, to sponsor her, to make this her career. And it was such a great experience in many ways. Now, of course, there were challenges coming into theater. I had never worked on theater. I had been a theater appreciator. And so, because of that, a lot of my focus was on the accessibility of the show. However, the change management internally was quite challenging because, well, there are many reasons. One, it turns out, I learned this once I started working on Broadway, that yes, there's a company for each of the shows, but the company is really the cast. It's the crew of stagehands and hair and makeup, props people. That's the company. But the design teams and the creative teams for each show, they're not part of the company. They're actually looking at each show as more of a project. And you might have a different director, producer, general manager, project stage manager, all coming together. They all have their own companies and they're coming together as almost like a joint venture. And then there's the layer of unions and other kind of policy makers and key players within the industry where it was difficult to shift individual parts such as the schedule or the script. If there was a moment where, it was not equitable or not inclusive in its language, and there was a way to shift that, that became a really big challenge. And so it was getting close to the end for me. I was finding more and more kind of walls because I was coming up against more and more things that just were immovable and difficult to change. And that's not any individual's fault. And I think any DEI practitioner, regardless of the type of work that you practice, you're going to hit those kinds of walls because these institutions and these industries have been working a very specific way for a very long time. So any shifts that we could make, I really appreciated, and I was hitting walls very often. And by the time I was laid off, I was actually approaching burnout. I had been a coach throughout my career. I started coaching school the first day of working in government. It was the same start day for both. I think it was May 15th, 2016 or 2017. And I had to take a pause from my coaching work in order to do my work in theater. And luckily I got to do a little bit of like wellness and hold space, particularly for marginalized folks within the company. But, I had hit enough challenges and hit enough walls, and I had been spinning my wheels for enough time that I was hitting burnout. And the way that I knew was, one, I had emotional exhaustion. It was really hard to go into certain situations with the emotional capacity that I needed for those situations. And then the other part was feeling like what I was doing wasn't making a difference. So I knew that I was having that experience even going into that meeting. And in that meeting, it was actually a surprise. I had gone in with a proposal for, a training series for the next year. It never got to see the light of day because in that meeting, I was told that my contract was not going to continue. My first reaction, I remember, was panic because who wants to lose a job? And my second reaction was relief because I knew that at some level, there was nothing more that I could do. And I needed a break. I did my last, I think I had a 6 week out in my contract. They basically said, like, once, on either side of the table, if this contract is ending, there's 6 weeks left to it. I happened to get COVID about 2 weeks after I was told that I was laid off. So I actually didn't really have an offboarding process because once I felt better, it was basically my last day, which is quite par for the course given my body's reaction to the burnout and then to the layoff. It really needed a break. And I ended up taking what was intended to be about a month off before going back in. I was laid off in October of 2022. My intention was to have a new job by December. And then I had a conversation with one of my mentors, and she said, "Why don't you just take off the rest of the year?" And I ended up taking off even more time than that. And in that time, there's like a detox phase, right? Of when you are kind of spinning your wheels. I imagined that I was like spinning my wheels. I was this freight train going in one direction. And I kept hitting walls and I kept trying and I kept trying. And then once I was able to slow down, I had to stop completely before I could change direction. And so I took that pause, and I have not worked in DEI since. In February of 2023, I reached out to some folks. I had a few kind of workshops that I was doing with the HR that I was working with on Broadway. So I did a little bit of DEI work, but really I was more focused on my coaching work. And now I'm in my coaching work full time. And the work that I do now is not necessarily supporting predominantly white institutions to become more inclusive or become more equitable or become more diverse. The people that I support now are the folks who were in those places and now are starting their own things. They are no longer trying to pull up a chair at the table and like trying to build a bigger table. They're like, fuck that, I'm building my own table. But there's an unlearning of the ways that we operate when you are trying to do your own thing. And I find, and I've done this too, there's a overcorrection. So maybe you don't want to operate in a punitive way, you don't want to operate in a supremacist way, and you don't want to create a toxic environment. And so sometimes you kind of start to bend over backwards for your team. And that's not what folks want either. That's not what creates an effective team either. And that's not what moves us forward either. And so the support that I provide and the support that I needed once I left was like, okay, like we're trying to create something new. What does that look like outside of these systems? These skills of building cultures from the ground up, building cultures in our teams and organizations that actually honors who we are as children of immigrants, as Black and brown folks, as queer and trans folks, people who have marginalized identities, as we are trying to build our teams. This is brand new territory in one sense, because the ways that we have experienced our workplaces and institutions is that those places were built for cis white men. And we are trying to create something new that is not that. And so there's a newness there, but there's also a remembering of our ancestral ways, right? Of how do we repair rather than punish? How do we set our folks up for success in a way that isn't creating urgency? And there's so many different aspects of leadership that operates outside of this frame of how do I make my institution look one way, then change it to another. And this is what I mean by DEI is not the same as liberation, especially in the context of our purpose and our the work that we are doing in the world. And it's the other reason why is that the private sector, again, began quietly rolling back DEI years ago. In some cases, in my case, they eliminated the role faster than it even took to create. And here's the other reality, right? And again, no blame, no shame, no, I'm not angry about it. But I have observed that when the production closed in San Francisco and then we had the New York production, there were no other positions that were eliminated. It was the DEI position that was eliminated. So if this was really a budget thing, then I would assume that other positions would also be eliminated. But from my perspective and from my understanding, they were not. And, that tells me that there is this disinvestment in this idea that we have to look at all of the ways that we are operating and whether they are equitable or not. So if we kind of take a step back, there's been, at the time of this recording, there's a lot of conversation about Target versus Costco. And, I've said it before, Target was never going to be a beacon of liberation, but neither is Costco, right? Like DEI is about harm reduction. It's about mitigating the problems that we created by the overrepresentation of power of cis white men. And with this disinvestment and active harm towards communities of color, I'm thinking of the idea of karma, which basically means action, and that actions create more actions, right? The reality is that organizations like Target, they're going to do their thing, they're going to eliminate, and then that's going to create action by boycotts and protests, etc. And then the institutions that are really about it and really do want to invest in becoming more equitable, these predominantly white institutions, they're going to double down. And then the institutions that are kind of outside of that, that are trying to unlearn and undo that supremacy culture within themselves, they're going to continue their work too. So these gaps are going to be filled. We know this. There's so many organizations and so many companies that were started and they received a ton of funding in light of what was happening in 2020. And now that funding is going to come from somewhere else. And a lot of my healing work now is about navigating change. So I invite us to adapt. I invite us to emerge. I invite us to think differently. How can we operate outside of these systems? How can we create our own thing? Like maybe there's going to be a national retailer that's Black owned. Maybe there's going to be public companies devoted to public good and their boards are all folks of color. I have hope and faith that maybe that one day that will happen, especially in light of this very active harm against our communities. And so for us today, I'm like, give this what it's due. Give DEI what it's due. Give our institutions what they're due, right? Change how you use their dollar. Yes, participate in the boycott. Yes, change how you spend your money. Yes, switch from Target to Costco. And then let's focus on liberation too, right? Like, let's focus on creating our own spaces. Let's focus on spending our money with each other. Let's focus on community care rather than looking to these institutions to save us and, give us what we need, because they're not going to do that. White supremacy is always going to choose itself. So that's my call to action. Again, I no longer do DEI work. The work that I'm doing is focused on helping the folks who have left those institutions to create the cultures that honor their ancestors and honor who they are, and to create teams that do that and to create good in the world from that place. So let's do that. Let's do that. I don't have a great way to tie a bow on this story because, again, like, I think this is something that I'm still healing from. But I do want to express gratitude to all of the people who I worked with on Broadway, in government, in DEI. I learned a lot about what supremacy looks like and what it can look like, what possibilities there are outside of the way that we build these ladders. And honestly, there's still more work to do. So let's get to it. Thank you. Thank you for listening to What We Made Possible. I really hope this episode resonated. As a coach, I always end with action steps. And so I invite you to do something, which is to pause and ask yourself, what resonated? What am I taking away? And what's possible for me and my community now? If you liked this conversation, please leave a review and a rating. It helps so much. Thanks again.